Well, I can sit down now. Your pastor gave about as good a pitch for the importance of religious liberty as could be. I'm with you because he asked for hands of those who know about Liberty magazine. But at the risk of falling out of your favour, how many of you read Liberty magazine? Pretty good. It can never be a majority because, we send out as many as about 180,000 every issue. But of those, we can never identify more than about 14,000 go to Seventh-day Adventists. So given that we're over 1 million in this division, no one church has too many. But that's not good, because for decades we've been promoting this to you, that you would give the money and we would send it to somebody else. And as the pastor explained the situation, I think we need to be reading our own material. One magazine's not going to give you everything, but it'll be a good start. I don't know what you did a couple of weeks ago, but I'm sure you've already seen our materials that were sent out to every church. This is the brochure and other materials that were sent for the campaign. I thought we were being, maybe clever, but certainly right on mark to use as a visual a wall. Our whole country is polarized and conflicted, and even the government stopped because of a wall. Now, we all have opinions on that, and I don't want to get into that wall. I'm an immigrant. My wife is from Central America, a citizen for many, many decades, but, there's issues we can discuss on that. But when you're talking about religious liberty, the image that has motivated Seventh-day Adventists and many other Christians, Baptists in particular, since the founding of the United States, is the image of a wall of separation between church and state, a delineation between the sacred and the secular, what it boils down to, and to maintain that wall, which is really defined in the First Amendment, is the best we can do in the civil sphere to protect religious liberty. You look around the world and there are many cases of governments meddling in the consciences of their citizens, meddling to prevent them from worshipping anyone, say in communist countries, or in other countries in the past, particularly in Latin America, where the Roman Catholic Church had inordinate influence. The government would meddle to support and advance and prosecute the agenda of that one church, to the detriment of other churches and the ability of the individuals to make choices for themselves. So we're encouraging you, as we do every year, to support religious liberty and Liberty magazine. But this year, I think we've got a theme that you really should resonate. It's only about a year since we all celebrated, in one way or another, 500 years of the Protestant Reformation. And you only have to read Great Controversy to see the very real connection between the development of our church and its mission and the Reformation. We believe and we hold and we proclaim that we are in that tradition. And the Reformation was a reaction against force being used on the conscience in matters of religion. And so we want to maintain this freedom to make our choice. And when we talk about the wall, it's fine. It's an image that has a contemporary application. But please understand that it's God's way, I believe, of ensuring that we act as sovereign beings as He created us, to choose for or against the tree of knowledge of good and evil and for the tree of life, and to make choices that will affect our salvation. And by encouraging religious liberty for others, we're actually facilitating evangelization. So I'm saying that so that you don't think religious liberty is just something our church happens to do. It's inextricably tied up to our very message for these days. As Ellen White used to say, present truth. Alonzo T. Jones was the first religious liberty editor of our church and a contemporary of Ellen White, and I've studied him at great length since I've taken over this job nearly 20 years ago. And I want to allude to him a little bit in the talk this morning. While I was waiting to come up here in the pastor's study, I grabbed one of his Ellen White biography volumes from the shelf. It was the Australian years, 1891 to 1900, as I remember. And it never struck me before. She was 9 years in Australia, following on from the tumultuous events of the General Conference in 1888, where A.T. Jones figured large and our religious liberty message figured large. But it just hit me that I had worked 9 years in Australia. I grew up in Australia, left there as a teenager, turned 16 on the boat coming to the US. My father transferred to the General Conference, but I had a great burden to go back. And whether it's always worked to my personal advantage, I'm not so sure anymore. But after my father took us to different countries of the world, and in particular going to India when I was still a teenager, it just was a shock to my system. First to see the untold millions of people, most of them not knowing about Christianity or the things of God, totally different religious scenario, but to see that our church was struggling there, because when they baptized people, very often, if they had any means, they would come to the US, never return to India, and the work was struggling. So when I finished college, and I was married shortly after, I applied to go back, and I went back for 9 years, coming back in 1985. But I had 10 years before that in the US, so I think I know this country. In fact, I really should be telling people that I'm an American, because I've lived here longer than most people have been alive. But the reason I'm bold enough to keep talking about Australia is because my accent gives me away. I'll probably never lose that. But let me tell you a story. Even as I'm starting, I'm thinking of a couple of weeks ago, well, a week and a half ago, I was at 3ABN again filming. I go there periodically. And every time I fly into St. Louis, I think of Mark Twain. And in particular, his story, Huckleberry Finn, now I'm forgetting the story. What's the first one that comes before that? Tom Sawyer. I don't know why I couldn't remember Tom Sawyer. But I think of that all the time. You know, he in the cave with Becky, those of you who read it, you know, that's an Injun Joe and all the rest. That when I was a kid, that stirred my imagination. But every time I fly to St. Louis, I know that very close by were the literal places that he set that story. He lived there for some time. And I've got to tell you, as I think about that story, it reminds me a lot of growing up in Australia. In many ways, when I was younger, walking to school, public school, for several years before we moved closer to the division office, it was that sort of a life that Mark Twain spoke about with Tom Sawyer. I can remember it now. I can remember the summer days walking about 2 miles to school, down the main street where we lived, across a railway line crossing, underneath, not supposed to be underneath, but underneath another crossing where I would dabble in the dirty water that was running under the train tracks, and often stop near the train tracks and put pennies and other things on the railway line to get the train to smash them, climb up trees. I remember once my mother said she was shopping and she saw all these women gathered around, horrified, and they were looking at something up the tree, and she looks up there and I'm up the top of the tree. I never fell, but I do remember once having broken a collarbone, going to the doctor and being taken to the doctor, and he says, "Now don't go falling out of any trees." And the humiliating reality is I'd fallen out of bed, but if I'd ever fallen from a tree, it wouldn't have turned well. And I remember another day heading off for school with a brand new pair of shoes and came home barefoot. And I can remember my mother being most perplexed because I seemed to have no explanation what happened to the shoes. I did know, but I couldn't tell her because it had everything to do with paddling barefoot through the drainage channels underneath the railway crossing. And of course, diphtheria and other stuff doesn't cross a kid's mind. But you know, that was the reality going to school. It was sort of the golden time of growing up. And I could write books just like Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens did. But I've got to tell you, in that time period, there was a singular event that will never leave my mind. because one of the places that I used to dally on the way to school was an empty block near houses, but it was a block that had never been built on. And it was overgrown with weeds, and there were piles of dirt and all sorts of fun topography that we could play with. And I remember a number of the kids used to go there in the dirt, smooth the dirt out, and put marbles in the center of a finger-drawn circle, and we'd play marbles. And if you could bash the marbles out with your marble, you had to keep the ones that came out. And that was the era or the time when having a few ball bearings was worth a fortune for a marble player, because they would never come out. But one day, as I was walking home from school, I looked and expected to go in and play in this empty lot, and lo and behold, instead of an empty, overgrown lot, now it was transformed. There was a large circus-type tent pitched. This was a novelty, and it got my attention. And out front of the tent was a big sign, probably as big as the screen, with hand-painted illustration, very bold colors, and of course, circus-type bannering. And the picture was of a knight with his armor, a medieval soldier. And there were a few monsters. And then there was another picture, actually, there were two big signs. Another one showed a man with a great burden on his back. And there was a barker out front, and he says, "Come, kids, come and see a program. Every day after school, come and watch this program. We're going to tell you the story of Pilgrim on his way through all sorts of dangers and adventures on his way to a wonderful city." And I've got to tell you, that changed my life, as I was only about six or 7 years old at that time. And I wouldn't miss that for anything. And I remember on one occasion watching it wrapped, as they, it's before television or anything high-tech, they were just showing single slides of the different episodes as someone narrated the story. And I was sitting there wrapped, and there's a tap on my shoulder. I turn around, there's both my parents. And they pulled me out because I had a dental appointment that afternoon and I hadn't turned up for it. And they didn't know I was there. How they tracked me down, I don't know. I'll never know because they're both dead now. But I remember that. And I just want to remind you of the significance, if you've never read Pilgrim's Progress, the significance of that book. I have a burden that I've had since I've taken over with Liberty Magazine to explain to people on this continent, Seventh-day Adventists, inheritors of the Reformation, explain to us the connections that we have to England on religious liberty. I studied history here. I was a history major for a long time. And if in high school, certainly, you get the idea that things almost started with the Pilgrim landing at Plymouth Rock. Where they came from is not even clearly explained. Holland, they were Englishmen, but they were there for a while, and then they turned up at Plymouth Rock, and then the story of their Pilgrim forebears sort of picks up, and you understand that they had some little bearing on religious developments in this country, and you certainly learn that they weren't very friendly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They persecuted a few people. Anne Hutchinson was disciplined for speaking out of line about spiritual matters. Quakers were hung in Boston because they didn't like their form of religion. So the Puritans were not too friendly in New England. But nobody seems to know or remember or care to find out where they came from. John Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress about 100 years before the American War of Independence, where we separated from England. And John Bunyan is tied up with the story of the Puritans. England had become a Protestant country, of course, as you probably remember, with the separation that Henry VIII established, supposedly to clear his way for a remarriage, but actually it was a little deeper than that. There had been efforts at Reformation about 100 years before with John Wycliffe and the Lollards and and the development of Reformation thinking in England. And by the time of John Bunyan and his peers, the Puritan element in England had become a major movement. They were Church of England, which is, today, or Episcopal Church. It's still sort of a high church. They don't have a pope, but it's much the same sort of worship and mentality as Catholicism. But the Puritans were Bible-reading, Bible-studying Protestants who were determined that they would change their lives in imitation of Christ. They determined that Christianity was not just a one-day-a-week affair, that their whole lives needed to be ordered around Bible truth. And consequently, they found themselves in great opposition to the established church. And if you go and read that English history, you'll see that political agitation was the order of the day. In fact, just the other day, it hit me. More than a few parallels to today. The King of England and of Scotland, there's no evidence that he was a greatly religious person, but he was influenced by his Roman Catholic wife, and so the Puritans and others were most agitated that this king might re-Catholicize England. So he dismissed Parliament. He didn't want to rule with the people's help. He figured he could do it all on his own. But then he was forced to call Parliament into session because of a great project. He wanted to go to war with his homeland of Scotland over who would appoint bishops. It was called the Bishops' War. He wanted funding that Parliament would give him. Not a wall in his case, but a big project. So he called an unfriendly Parliament together. They started murmuring against the king. The king was upset about this, so he marched into Parliament with his personal guard behind him to arrest the Speaker of the House. Often the Speaker is the object of the ruler's ire. And the Speaker went out the back door, and a few other leaders and ringleaders that the king wanted to arrest. So the king was sort of left hanging, and he says, "Oh, I see the birds have flown." So then he dismissed Parliament, and they all went out the back door and plotted and planned and formed an army, and England had a civil war for a number of years between initially the parliamentarian armies and the Catholic supported armies of the king. But by about halfway through the Civil War, it turned into the Puritans against the aristocracy. And finally, they captured the king, defeated him decisively, captured him, put him on trial as a traitor because he was plotting to bring a Catholic army into England, and they cut off his head. This is 100 years before the French Revolution. And his appeal was they couldn't do it because he was divinely put in place, and by the divine right of kings, by definition, anything he said and did was God's will. And the Puritans knew otherwise because they'd been reading the Bible. And they cut his head off, and their general, Oliver Cromwell, ruled unopposed, but for a very short period of time, as the Lord Protector, basically the king, but he wouldn't take the crown. So now what has this got to do with the US? All things come to an end, and when Oliver Cromwell died, then it got complicated. The Puritans had been in power. They'd run England as a religious republic. Oliver Cromwell was most sympathetic to a few of the main threads of Puritanism, and there was one group called the Fifth Monarchy men. They'd been studying the image of Daniel 2, and they believed they were in the fifth and final kingdom, the kingdom of God, and so they were going to establish it on earth in anticipation of the stone cut out without man's hand. They were prophetically inclined. So he was favorable to them. But when he died, amazingly, the common people were tired of religion, tired of the Puritan overlordship, so they invited the king's son back, and of course he was not happy about those who'd cut his father's head off. So he went around trying to execute those ringleaders against his father's rule. And during that period, again about 70, 80 years before the American Revolution, tens of thousands of Puritans flooded into this country. Not nice settlers that came at Plymouth Rock, but ex-revolutionaries with a view that they would establish God's kingdom literally in a promised land. If you know anything about Adventist history and Christians at the time our church began, you'll know that everybody had in their possession, invariably, of course, a Bible. They would always then have Fox's Book of Martyrs. They would have John Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, which you should read, because Ellen White drew heavily on those books, and John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan was a soldier in that Civil War. By his own testimony, he was a foul-mouthed, non-religious fellow. Nevertheless, he fought on the side of the Puritans against the king. And after the war, he became, and I'll read you a little bit later about how he changed, he became an itinerant, independent preacher at a time when you had to be authorized by the state. You had to have a preaching license from the state. And you couldn't just preach in the street. I'm sorry, you can't today either, can you? If you go to an intersection in this town and start Bible thumping, I think you'll find after a while the police will sidle up to you and ask where your permit is. And you might be arrested. And this happened to John Bunyan. And he eventually spent, I think it was 11 years in Bedford jail because he would not preach with a license. And there was a classic story of his wife following the judges around actually on many occasions, but one day she says, "Please let my husband go. We have a family to feed. My husband's in jail. They're starving. Please have mercy on us." And the judge turns around and he says, "Madam, all he has to do is stop preaching." And she said, "Oh no, he will never do that. Never." Well, while he was in prison, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. The story of one man's, it's a dream, but given figuratively. And I was in the Sabbath school class this morning, I was listening as we went through Revelation. And a lot of people have trouble with Revelation because they take literally figurative things, which have literal meanings, but don't take figurative language absolutely at face value. Look at what it means. This is our cover of our January-February issue of Liberty magazine. I'm sure from a distance you can't see it too clearly. It's a woodcut from an early edition of Pilgrim's Progress. And there's that figure in a medieval knight outfit with a shield, back in the corner, really in a very defensive position as a fiend, John Bunyan called him, with the head of a lion and scales and fiery darts, comes at him. Looks like it's all over for this knightly figure. This is one of the most interesting and most dynamic encounters that Pilgrim, Christian / John Bunyan had in his adventures, leaving a city of destruction with a burden on his back. In other words, his sins and all of the effects of his worldly life and his swearing and his cursing as a military man. But in the story, of course, that falls off at the place of the tomb and of the cross, when he realizes what Jesus had done for him. But he still had a way to go. And I want to read you just a little as a reminder of how exciting this can be. In the Valley of Humiliation, Pilgrim meets this fiend called Apollyon, another one of the names for Satan, or the evil fiend that we all have to deal with. And then I'll read it for you with no real comment. He says, "In the Valley of Humiliation, poor Christian was hard put to it, for he had gone but a little way before he espied a foul fiend coming over the field to meet him. His name is Apollyon. Then did Christian begin to be afraid and to cast in his mind whether to go back or stand his ground. But he considered again that he had no armor for his back, and therefore thought that to turn back to him might give him greater advantage. Then Apollyon met him. Now the monster was hideous to behold. He was clothed with scales like a fish. They are his pride. His wings were like a dragon, his feet like a bear, and out of his belly came fire and smoke, and his mouth was the mouth of a lion. When he was come up to Christian, he beheld him with a disdainful countenance and began to question with him. 'Where are you come from?' And where are you bound? Said Apollyon. I am come from the city of destruction, says Christian, which is the place of all evil, and I'm going to the city of Zion. By this I perceive that thou art one of my subjects, says Apollyon. For that country is mine, and I am the prince and god of it. How is it that you have run away from your king? Were it not that I hope that thou mayst do me more service, I would strike thee now at one blow to the ground. I was indeed born in your kingdom, says Christian, but your service was hard, and your wages such as a man could not live on, for the wages of sin is death. Therefore, when I was come to years, I did as other thoughtful persons do, look out if perhaps I might mend myself. There is no prince, says Apollyon, that will thus lightly lose his subjects, neither will I as yet lose thee. But since thou complainest of thy service and wages, be content to go back, and what our country will afford thee, I promise to give thee. But I have let myself to another, says Christian, even to the king of princes, and how can I with fairness go back with thee? Thou hast done in this according to the proverb, says Apollyon, changed a bad for a worse. But it is common for those who have called themselves his servant after a while to give him the slip and return to me. Do thou too, and all will be well. I have given him my faith, says Christian, and sworn my service to him. How then can I go back from this and not be hanged as a traitor? Thou didst the same to me, and yet I'm willing to pass by all if thou wilt turn again and go back. What I promised thee was in my youth, says Christian, and besides, I count that the prince under whose banner I now stand is able to set me free, yea, and to pardon also what I did in my service with thee. And besides, destroying Apollyon, to speak the truth, I like his service, his wages, his servants, his government, his company and country, better than thine. Therefore leave off to persuade me further. I am his servant, and I will follow him. And Apollyon said, consider when thou art in cold blood what you are likely to meet with in the way that thou goest. Thou knowest that for the most part his servants come to an ill end, because they are disobedient against me and my ways. How many of them have been put to shameful deaths? And besides, thou countest his service better than mine, whereas he never yet came from the place where he is to deliver any that served him out of their hands. But as for me, how many times, as all the world well knows, have I delivered, either by power or by fraud, those who have faithfully served me from him and his, though taken by them, and so I will deliver thee, says Apollyon. Christian said this, and it's interesting. His forbearing at present to deliver them is on purpose to try their love, whether they will cleave to him to the end. And as for the ill end that thou sayest they come to, that is most glorious in their account. For present deliverance they do not much expect it. For they stay for their glory, and when they shall have it, when their prince comes in his and the glory of the angels. Then Apollyon broke out into a grievous rage, saying, I am an enemy to this prince. I hate his person, his laws and people, and I am come out on purpose to withstand thee. And Christian said, Apollyon, beware of what you do, for I am in the king's highway, the way of holiness. Therefore, take heed to thyself. Then Apollyon quite straddled the whole breadth of the way and said, I am void of fear in this matter. Prepare thyself to die, for I swear by my infernal den that thou shalt go no further. Here I will spill thy soul. And with that he threw a flaming dart at his breast. But Christian held a shield in his hand. Remember the Bible reading? What's the shield of faith, isn't it? Held a shield in his hand with which he caught, and so prevented the danger of that. Then did Christian draw, for he saw that it was time to bestir him. And Apollyon as fast made at him, throwing darts as thick as hail, by which, notwithstanding all that Christian could do to avoid it, Apollyon wounded him in his head, his hand, and his foot, an allusion to Christ. This made Christian give a little back. Apollyon therefore followed his work amain, and Christian again took courage and resisted as manfully as he could. This sore combat lasted for above half a day, until Christian was almost spent. For you must know that Christian, by reason of his wounds, was growing weaker and weaker. Then Apollyon, espying his opportunity, began to gather up close to Christian, and wrestling with him gave him a dreadful fall, and with that Christian's sword flew out of his hand. Then said Apollyon, I am sure of you now. My wife always calls me while I'm speaking. I am sure of you now. And with that, he had almost pressed him to death, so that Christian began to despair of life. But as God would have it, while Apollyon was fetching his last blow to make a full end of this good man, Christian nimbly reached out his hand for his sword and caught it, saying, Rejoice not against me, O mine enemy. When I fall, I shall arise. And with that, he gave him a deadly thrust, which made him give back as one that had received his mortal wound. Christian, perceiving that, made at him again, saying, Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. And with that, Apollyon spread forth his dragon's wings and sped him away. And Christian, for a season, saw him no more. Powerful stuff. You know, in his day, the tinker from Bedford, because he was a tinker, in other words, just an itinerant seller of household goods, that was how he got some money as well as his preaching. That tinker really could move people. And there was a story told that I've only fairly recently read, that the most eminent theologian and friend of both Oliver Cromwell and the King, John Owen, Professor the Reverend John Owen, went once to hear him speak. And John Owen was an interesting character. He was the chaplain to Parliament under Oliver Cromwell. And amazingly, even though it was a revolutionary time, when the king came back, or the king's son came back, he became chaplain to the king. And on this one occasion, he went to hear John Bunyan preach, and the king mocked him, and he says, Why are you going to hear that simple fool, that uneducated guy, John Bunyan? He says, You're an educated man. He says, why would you bother? And John Owen said, Your Majesty, he said, I would give all of my learning and everything that I have if I could preach and move men like that tinker. Amen. So it's worth remembering, John Bunyan wasn't in the back blocks of the country. He was brought to speak indirectly, in this case, to the king. And it was John Owen that actually paid his fine and got him released finally from jail. I am moved still today by that. It's not just when I was a 7 or 8 year old. The story is powerful, and it's not just a kid's tale. He's put into dramatic human narrative the spiritual battle that everybody that wants to escape the bonds that we live under, the sinful world, everybody that wants to travel in their life but spiritually on the way to the promise of that celestial city has to go through that. And I want to share something further with you that you probably don't know. Anyone know of any other books that John Bunyan wrote? Yes. What's one of them? There's The Holy War, another one that he wrote, and Grace Abounding. That's the shortened version. The real version's like about 4 lines long. They didn't have short titles back then. In Pilgrim's Progress, he tells it through the figure of a dream. But in Grace Abounding, he tells it straight. And I can't read you his whole life story. Go online, you can find the book. But I want to get to the nitty-gritty of how come a rough and tough soldier in a Civil War experience, it doesn't come much more dangerous and bloody than that, when every man's hand is against his brother. And he discovered God in the truest sense. This is how John Bunyan explained it. I pulled the central narrative of how he changed from that crazy guy, non-Christian guy, to a powerful preacher. He says, I fell into company with one poor man that made a profession of religion. It's often how we come into the church. Somebody influences us, right? I fell into company with one poor man that made profession of religion, who, as I then thought, did talk pleasantly of the Scriptures and of the matters of religion. Wherefore, falling into some love and liking to what he said, I betook me to my Bible and began to take great pleasure in reading, but especially with the historical parts thereof. You know what he's talking about? Adventists are much inclined to this sort of Bible study. Not wrong, but if it doesn't go any further, that's a very dangerous state. So he says, I fell into a pleasure in reading, but especially with the historical parts. Thus I continued about a year, all of which time our neighbours did take me to be a very godly man, a new and religious man, and did marvel much to see such a great and famous alteration in my life and manners. And indeed so it was, though as yet I knew not Christ, nor grace, nor faith, nor hope. For as I have well seen since, he said, had I then died, my state would have been most fearful. Yet I loved to be talked of as one that was truly godly. I was proud of my godliness, and indeed I did all that I did, either to be seen of or to be well spoken of by men. But upon a day, the good providence of God called me to Bedford to work on my calling, and his calling was to preach. And in one of the streets of that town, I came upon 3 or 4 poor women sitting at a door in the sun, talking about the things of God. And being now willing to hear them discourse, he says, I drew near to hear what they said, for I was now a brisk talker also myself in the matters of religion. But I may say, I heard but understood not, for they were far above, out of my reach. Their talk was about a new birth, the work of God on their hearts, also how they were convinced of their miserable state by nature. They talked how God had visited their souls with his love in the Lord Jesus, and with what words and promises they had been refreshed, comforted, and supported against the temptations of the devil. And methought they spake as if joy made them speak, he says. They spake with such pleasantness of scripture language and with such appearance of grace in all that they said, that they were to me as if they had found a new world, as if they were people that dwelt alone and were not to be reckoned among their neighbours. At this I felt my own heart began to shake and mistrust my condition to be naught, for I saw that all my thoughts about religion and salvation, the new birth, did never enter into my mind. Neither knew I the comfort of the word and promise, nor the deceitfulness and treachery of my own wicked heart. And I should tell you what he says now. He uses a figure. I don't know what you have here, but in Australia, when I used to walk through the stagnant pools and all the rest, you'd get leeches on you, sometimes very big. They could get really fat when they suck your blood. Keep that in mind. He says, by these things my mind was now so turned that it lay like a horse leech at the vein, still crying out, give, give, give. Yea, it was so fixed on eternity and on the things about the kingdom of heaven that as far as I knew, though as yet God knows I knew but little, neither pleasures, nor profits, nor persuasions, nor threats could loose it or make it let go its hold. You know, that's an experience that hardly is hinted at, even with a lot of our public talk about religion. But it's at the root of Pilgrim's Progress. You know, you don't get to heaven just by going through the patterns of religious life. It's a battle and a march, but if we march on the right highway, victory is assured. And back to 1888, when Alonzo T. Jones, A.T. Jones, the Religious Liberty editor, spoke at the General Conference session. He was talking about this. Over the years in Australia, I had many people approach me on the 1888 question. Some of them left-wing, some of them right-wing, and they were both convinced there was some secret message. If they could decode it in 1888, they would understand what A.T. Jones was speaking about and what Ellen White so supported, because she was with him all the way. In fact, A.T. Jones was the closest thing Ellen White had to a protege. I should tell you a little funny story. It'll show you the relationship between them. As they began that General Conference session, when there were only about 25,000 Adventists, by the way, they had a preliminary meeting to discuss what Germanic tribes made up the 10 nations of Europe. Very important to them back then, analyzing the figure of Daniel 2, the toes on that modern ending kingdom must mean something. And Uriah Smith got up and gave his version. And after he finished, A.T. Jones jumped up and he says, "Your brother Smith may not know who those nations were and who those toes are." He says, "But I know." And Ellen White next to him says, "Easy, Brother Jones, easy, Brother Jones." She was always telling him not to be so combative, back off a little bit. But when he spoke at the General Conference session in 1888, and in spite of what both of those factions years ago who used to argue about it thought, it wasn't the end for A.T. Jones. He was the speaker at the next 2 General Conference sessions. And his message was the same. He was pushing for a total change of life. And as he pointed out at the next General Conference session, he says, when they say that they're going to take away your livelihood if you don't worship on the false Sabbath, when they threaten your family, then and threaten to take your very life away, he says, you can't stand. He says, who will hold up against it? To lose your life, that's an incredible thing. But he says, if your life is already hid with Christ, if you've died to this world, if your mind is so set on heaven, he says, they can't take that away from you. You're unchangeable. And that's what is needed. That's what A.T. Jones was calling for. Or to use the biblical term, which we don't mention much anymore, new birth. Jesus with Nicodemus. They're strolling in the darkness of the evening when this leader in Israel, wanted to talk to Jesus, wanted to get the nitty-gritty, but didn't want to come in the daylight. It would sort of diminish his public standing. So he comes and says, teacher, we know you're from God, but, what do you got to tell me? And Jesus cut to the quick and says, unless you're born again, you cannot even see the kingdom of heaven. The language there's most plain. It's not that you won't get to heaven. You can't comprehend spiritual things adequately without a total change of mind where you're like a pilgrim there. You're set for the celestial city. Doesn't mean that you're already one of the 144,000. That perplexed early Adventists. It's still in our lesson, troubles Adventists greatly. They're a group that go through the time of trouble beyond which, time most of us will never get for one reason or another. But we are all called, as C.S. Lewis said, and I don't much care for C.S. Lewis in his famous book, Mere Christianity, we're all called to be new people, not good people. The world is full of good people, mostly bad people, but there's plenty of good people around. In my previous job, one of them, as editor of Listen magazine, I used to meet often with people in the religious right as well as public high schools and so on. And I was most impressed with many of them. And I used to love to hear them pray fervently that God would heal this nation. And they didn't pray that lightly. They were people that were agonizing over the lack of God's Spirit in the nation as a whole. They wanted God to do something powerful. They're good enough people. But unless they're born again, unless you and I are born again, we don't truly comprehend God's kingdom. And in fact, I'll put it to you another way. If you're not born again, you're much more liable to try to establish that kingdom here rather than realize that it lies ahead of us across Jordan. It's an interesting dynamic. And A.T. Jones, when I go back and I've read it over and over again, I think he understood it. And it didn't just pop out of nowhere, because A.T. Jones, with Ellen White's agreement, believed that he was in the final battle there for religious liberty in this country. In 1888, the United States generally was going through a transformative period. It was not the nation we imagine now. It was barely a country. Remember, in 1812, only a bare generation earlier, England attacked, or actually America declared war, but there was a war between England and America, and England didn't even recognize that it was a country. It was all over England. Anytime they met an American boat, they would take the sailors into the British Navy. They did it with the English ships. They just counted this as a rebel part of the British Empire. So in 1888, it was barely established. The Civil War had ripped it apart, and it was still sort of shuddering. It was not a very coherent whole. And early industrialization was shaking up what people thought of as America anyhow. They were being forced out of the country into the cities, and a lot of poverty, and the robber barons were running amok. Read the history of it. It's a very pre-revolutionary period. And people needed security. And so there were many groups, many church groups, many groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was very strong then. And Ellen White spoke on their behalf many times against alcohol and tobacco. But the WCTU had a religious agenda too, and they were pushing for a national Sunday law. Not a blue law, which they have many of, and we still do today. About 20 states have lots of blue laws on their books that can be applied anytime they want. I remember going to North Dakota last year, and on the Sunday wanting to go to Walmart, buy something. And here, when I arrived, shut, no cars there. And on the front door is a paper stuck on. It said, due to Sunday blue laws, we're not able to open on Sunday. And if Walmart can't open on Sunday, nobody will. They never shut. So, you know, the blue laws had been around. They were held in high esteem by many religious groups. But what was planned in 1888 was another big step. And you can go online, you can still look up the text to it. It was most unambiguous. Senator Blair brought in a law that said on the Lord's Day, Sunday, everybody under pain of law is to cease from their labor and attend church. And they just had small allowances for emergency services and so on. But basically everything was to shut down. And A.T. Jones and Ellen White and a number of the other pioneers believed this was the final Sunday law. Now, if it had been, were they ready? I nearly made a joke early on that today is sort of a Gideon day. I have a feeling if the story of Gideon had taken place in North America, that part of the story would have been a snowstorm or something like it. But, you know, things that come up in Gideon's day, you know, the fields. If you need to go back to your farms, Gideon said to the original group, you know, feel free. So most of them went. And then they were separated by one form or another till there were just a few faithful ones left. And this, you know, is basically the way things go. And the Sunday law was something that clearly was going to put that unprepared 25,000 people or so right into the fire. And they were not ready. And A.T. Jones knew it. Ellen White knew it. So what do? They needed a revival. They needed a refreshing. They needed to discover the real dynamic in being a Christian, a victorious Christian, to defeat Apollyon or any other principality or power. And revival, but I'm hesitating on it. Revival means you were once alive and you're revived, brought to life again. But if you've never known Christ, like John Bunyan, what do? You have to have that experience first. And I know that our church, I've grown up in the church, I'm a fourth generation Adventist, and of all of the problems we face, and at the moment rebellion is the key one, but of all of the problems that we face, at root is that way too many people are not born-again Christians. Even this rebellion that is administratively at root or at foot wouldn't exist the same way if they were born-again Christians in major positions. It wouldn't. You know, a lot of people forming committees at the moment, how to deal with this or that, the other. They think that there'd be some sort of administrative method to bring people into line. There never was in our church, never was. We don't have any inquisition. We don't have mechanisms of control from the top down, and correctly so. But I remember when I was younger why it wasn't as problematic, Because most people working for the church, most pastors, most administrators, like my father, used to hold in reverence the cause, the movement. When you have people that are, as Pilgrim before Apollyon says, I'm serving this king. He's the one that I'm doing all this for. You're not so easily subverted to sidetracks or to Morality Village or Vanity Fair or anything like that. The proverbial places that diverted people. It was an interesting time. And A.T. Jones turned out to be wrong, maybe. It's possible that it was all about to happen there, but the revival didn't take enough root that God's people were not ready. Ellen White does say any number of times that the Lord could have come before this, but we were not ready, and so we sort of like the children of Israel in the desert. We go around for another 40 years, 180 years, 120 years. It's hard to know. But I believe, and please come this afternoon, I believe there's some evidence that we're at another moment of truth as they were in 1888. And it's not for me or you to know definitively that this is it, but I think it is much more likely to be it than it was in 1888. I think everything is in a row now, not to cause us trouble. I had an afternoon meeting recently in Washington State, actually. I won't tell you the church, but south of Seattle. And there was an elderly gentleman in the second row, and he called out to me. He says, "Tell us when we should be afraid." Now, what about Apollyon there on that picture, with his back there and the shield up, and he's not a Christian with Apollyon coming at him. Should he be afraid? He was only to be afraid when he turned his back to him, where he had no armor. We're not to be afraid. Perfect love casts out all fear, we're told. This is a moment of opportunity for God's people. And I can tell you in Washington, the pastor was alluding to our dinner. We're making an effect there. Some of these top people attend, some of them speak. We contact them one way or another during the year. They listen to us as they never have before. Whether they come and join us, that remains to be seen. But they're not closing their doors on us. This is not a time when the work is closing up, but at the same time that we have opportunities, the behind the scenes, as Ellen White said in her day, things are reformulating in a way that is going to bring, for those who are not observing it, a sudden move toward Sunday law and the very final events. And I personally believe it's all done except the final crisis. And some initiating thing could be huge earthquake on the West Coast. It could be another 9/11 type incident. It could be another 2008 economic collapse. Improbable things, right? But all of the above, or any one of the above, could do it. We don't know, but we are told an overwhelming surprise is coming on the world. But for those that trust in the Lord, for those that are seeking the celestial city and not dabbling with the city of destruction to their own destruction, it shouldn't be confusing. It should be invigorating. My father's been dead for 11 years now. But I often used to call him up and tell him some of these developments that I thought were shocking in their own way. And I never was able to get anything out of him but one response. He would invariably say, "Isn't it exciting? The Lord's about to come." So, don't think religious liberty is to scare you, but it should sharpen your response. It should cause you to reach for the armor. And as a dedicated, born-again follower of the Lord, it's our privilege to appropriate all the armor we need for victory here and a progress toward an eternal kingdom. That's what Adventism's about. It's not, as many of our deluded fellows think, about a church structure, good as it may be, and it's better than most. But the structure is not what's going through. It's the faithful people, the born-again Seventh-day Adventist believers who live and breathe and yearn, or Ellen White uses the term, looking wistfully to heaven. You want to be there. For those people, this is an exciting time, a time when we're about to Truly, we're told to lift up our heads because our redemption draweth nigh. Remember the old guy living through a civil war. Remember the dream that John Bunyan had. Remember the reality of his life. Remember the reality of early Adventism. Let me just close by reading you a couple of words from a little book that I discovered the other day. Little Time of Peace it's called, a little hardcover. That I inherited all my father's stuff, but I haven't yet sorted through most of it. And this was printed in Australia. It's a compilation of Ellen White quotes. And I noticed, looking at my father's handwriting, that he was, I think, 16 or 17 when he got this, about the age when I left Australia. And he'd marked up a lot of stuff. But this is what Ellen White had written in Testimonies, Volume 9. Yeah, this is a quote. She says, "The crisis coming. Everything in the world is in agitation. The signs of the times are ominous. Coming events cast their shadows before." And this was printed, by the way, just after World War I. And that was an ominous time to live through. "The Spirit of God is withdrawing from the earth," she wrote, "and calamity follows calamity by sea, by land. There are tempests, earthquakes, fires, floods, murders of every grade. Who can read the future? Where is security? There is assurance in nothing that is human or earthly. Rapidly are men ranging themselves under the banner they have chosen. Restlessly are they waiting and watching the movements of their leaders. There are those who are waiting and watching and working for our Lord's appearing. Another class are falling into line under the generalship of the first great apostate. Few believe with heart and soul that we have a hell to shun and a heaven to win. The crisis is stealing gradually upon us. The sun shines in the heavens, passing over its usual round, and the heavens still declare the glory of God. Men are still eating and drinking, planting and building, marrying and giving in marriage. Merchants are still buying and selling. Men are jostling one against another, contending for the highest places. Pleasure lovers are still crowding to theatres, horse races, gambling halls. The highest excitement prevails, yet probation's hour is fast closing, and every case is about to be eternally decided. Satan sees that his time is short. He has set all of his agencies at work that men may be deceived, deluded, occupied, and entranced, until the day of probation shall be ended and the door of mercy be forever shut. Amen. Not shut yet, thanks to the Lord. And I pray that each of us will look to ourselves, and if we need a refreshing, now's the time to get it, because I hardly believe that if now, with all that's happened around us, if we're not stirred at this point, what could happen at some future time? Just more of the same. Might be more troubling, but not of a different nature. Now is the acceptable hour. Now is the time for salvation. God bless you.